Okay, so you guys are live now.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone to the District 12 Town Hall, recapping the 2021 legislative session. We're pleased that all of you have been able to join us this evening. And we have a busy series of questions that we want to get to as well. You all still have the opportunity to offer questions to submit to the District 12 team. I think there's a link that has been shared for you to go ahead and do so. That is still being actively monitored. So if you have questions that come to you during this session, please don't hesitate to submit them. So we'll go ahead and begin with some brief introductions of all of ourselves, and then go ahead and move into the question and answer session as part of this as well. So I'm Clarence Lamb, State Senator in District 12, and I serve on the Senate Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee. And my background is as a physician, so that's very fitting with a lot of the issues that we end up working on over there as well. So that's the standing committee that I serve on. I also serve on the Senate Executive Nominations Committee that reviews the governor's appointments to various boards, commissions, and agencies. And I serve as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Fair Practices and State Personnel Oversight, as well as the Joint Committee on Audits and Evaluations, and then serve as the Senate Chair for the Howard County delegation and the Vice Chair for the Baltimore County delegation. So happy to be part of this and appreciate all of you for joining us. And now we can move to the delegates, and maybe we'll just go in alphabetical order. So we can start hopefully with Delegate Ebersol. And you're muted.
So thank you again, Senator Lamb, for introducing me. Certainly appreciate that. I was trying to make sure that background noises. I have a window open here, so the cicadas are doing their work. I'm Eric Ebersol. I serve in District 12 with the rest of this wonderful group of people. And I am on the Ways and Means Committee, have been for all 7 sessions of my terms. I serve as a Deputy Majority Whip. In Ways and Means, I serve on 2 subcommittees, the Education Subcommittee and the Early Childhood Subcommittee. I chair that committee, which has to do with early childhood education issues, also special education issues and library issues. I serve on the Joint Committee for Children, Youth, and Families, which meets sometimes in the interim. I'm also the House Delegates Representative to the Education Commission of the States, Professional Standards for Teacher Education Board, and the State Interagency Council on Child Care. I'm also on the advisory board for the Maryland Center for School Safety, which is quite an important one to me. And I also serve as an advisory board on the Visit Howard County and on the Catonsville Y. I'm on the Community Leadership Board. Having been a teacher for 35 years and now being in the legislature, you can hear there's a lot of education in my assignments and there's a lot of education in my interests. Thank you.
All right.
I'm going to hand it off to next. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I'm Delegate Jessica Feldmark. I'm proud to represent District 12. This is my first term as a delegate, so I just completed my 3rd session in office. I too, like Delegate Ebersol, serve on the Ways and Means Committee. I serve on the Revenues Subcommittee and the Election Law Subcommittee, so have a different set of perspectives from the subcommittees, but enjoy serving together. Or Ways and Means, we deal with a lot of important issues. I'm also on the Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Biotechnology. And currently, I also serve as the House Chair for the Howard County delegation. So I'm going to keep it brief and look forward to getting to discussing some of your questions.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Terry Hill, the 4th leg on the 4-legged D12 stool. And I, like Senator Lamb, am a physician with practicing surgeon, and I serve on the Health and Government Operations Committee. The subcommittees are the Public Health and Minorities Health, Health Disparity Subcommittee, and the Government Operations and Healthcare Facilities Subcommittees. I'm currently also serving on the Next Gen 911 Commission and serve as the Baltimore County Delegation Secretary and the chair of the Baltimore County Bond Initiatives Delegation Committee. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So as you can see, we have a very diverse district delegation here, and we also cover a lot of different areas, as you can tell from our backgrounds and the committees that we're serving on. Great working relationship both amongst the legislators and also our staff. So I think we're on the same page on many types of issues, and also try to share constituent concerns that have come up as well. So we're happy to speak to them. Again, just as a reminder to those in attendance in the audience, if you have questions, we are still monitoring the live link for you to be able to submit your questions in addition to those that have already been pre-submitted before the session started. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? This was obviously a very unique session in the 2021 legislative year. This was after convening together again after the pandemic started locally here in March of 2020, which, as you'll probably recall, was a very unique year in itself. It was the first time since the Civil War that we adjourned early as a General Assembly. And so there was a concern when we started this legislative session, if we would be able to complete it. And fortunately we were, through a lot of protections and safeguards that were in place. That said, we also covered a lot of issues that took place during the interim as well as during the session. And we'll start with one issue that's very timely because it's still at the forefront of a lot of people's concerns, and that has to deal with unemployment. So we've had several questions regarding this, some on opposite ends of the spectrum here. So I'll begin with the first one, which is there was recent news that the governor last week decided to end unemployment assistance for Marylanders, despite the fact that the pandemic has not ended. So we had questions about why the governor decided to end the unemployment assistance at this time, and what are our thoughts about whether there should be further action to extend these unemployment benefits or not. I'll turn it over to our colleagues here.
Well, I'm happy to jump in and say I think it was a mistake to discontinue those benefits. Our offices, I know my colleagues all have similar experience. Our staff members who actually I should give a shout out to Katie in my office, Scott in Senator Lamb's office, Sean in Delegate Ebersol's office, and Amber in Delegate Hill's office. They all work together closely and have spent a lot of time over the past 15 months or so helping folks navigate what is really a broken unemployment insurance system in our Department of Labor. And I think the reason that the governor stated for ending the additional federal benefits was to make it easier for employers to find folks to fill positions. And I find that concerning. I mean, we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of constituents over the last year. There's not a single one of them who isn't eager to get back to work. And so I think, it is short-sighted. It's going to hurt a lot of families in need. The pandemic is still impacting us and impacting, unemployed workers. These are dollars that would help Maryland families and flow directly into Maryland's local economy. So I think it's really short-sighted to turn down that kind of federal assistance. Short-sighted from a fiscal perspective, and really unfair to workers who are still struggling to try to get through this.
I think that the governor has adopted what is very common among some people from the other party in our case, myths about people's willingness and interest in working. In the 80s, we had the myth of the welfare queen, pushed very hard after having hung around for a decade before that. And the myth here is that if you offer people money because they're out of a job, they won't try to get back to work. I think it's not correct. there are people who want to work. Some people are saying they're having trouble turning around and finding a job. The other thing that has happened, and I think this is quite interesting, is some people have used the fact that they were let go to take some time on their own dime and become educated to do perhaps jobs that pay better. One of the problems with the industries that are complaining about not being able to find workers is something that we've been addressing in the legislature for a bunch of years with minimum wage requirements and sick leave requirements. They're looking for jobs that have better work conditions, both in terms of money and general treatment. And what a lot of folks have done is actually equip themselves at the community colleges for jobs that actually pay better. So I'm hoping that what we're going to find here is that some of the businesses that have not done so well by their employees and paid them minimum wages of $10 or $7 at one point, ours is getting up around 11 now and will increase, will actually see the logic of actually offering better work conditions. Now, that means that when we get their services, we'll probably pay a little more at a restaurant. But to me, that's a small price for me to pay for the idea that the people that are working there are making a livable wage. And so the governor is basically stopping that process. And of course, the House of Delegates is going to have a hearing tomorrow. I encourage you to tune in on MGA LEG website. Economic Matters at 2:00 is going to have a hearing where they're going to deal with this. We don't have any real teeth right now because we're not in session, but I think maybe there'll be some action. I'm interested to go to that. I'm not on that committee, but I want to see what they say.
If I can just add one other thing, I would agree totally with what both Delegate Feltmark and Eversole said. And, the average rental monthly rate in Maryland is $1,400 a month, okay? Unemployment insurance comes out of a fund, and the additional federal dollars is, part of all of what the federal government is trying to do to make up for the fact that in order to deal with the pandemic, businesses were told to shut down, people were told to stay home. And the fact that there are folks who still don't have child care support, so can't get back to work, the fact that people still have health issues and can't get back to work, the fact that we've had a chronic issue for many jobs, inadequate pay. I think that if what the governor is saying is true, that an additional $300 a week for 2 months, because the federal benefits will dry up in 2 months' time, okay? If that's gonna make the difference, then we have a more grave problem with livable wages than we think. That comes out to the most you can get in unemployment. Understand this for people who've never had to experience it. There's a cap. You get at most $450 a week. The Fed's adding 300 makes that $750. You do the math on that for 52 weeks, you're talking about $37,000, $38,000 or something like that. And we're a state where the mean income, I already told you what the rent is, but the mean income is what, like 180? Not the mean income, I'm sorry, the value of a household is, $180,000. So we have people, he's saying that for, $38,000, these people aren't making enough when they're working to make $38,000 worth it for them to stay home. That's a problem, okay? That's a problem. So like everything else with the pandemic, what we're seeing exposed are the real problems with our system, our economic system, our social system, and everything else. And his failure to understand it, his failure to take responsibility for the ongoing problems that people they've earned the unemployment, they were told to stay home, whether it's the extra 300 or not, they're still not getting paid. Okay, you read in the paper today about more and new problems where folks went on to file their month of their weekly benefit, couldn't find the thing to click on. He's not taking responsibility, and he needs to.
Yeah, and let me just add this too, because I think there was one question here that more or less has been addressed by the responses so far, which is a concern that the continuation of the unemployment assistance is contributing to a scarcity of workers in certain industries. And I think, to add on to the responses here on this, that the recovery has been uneven, right? So there have been some industries that have, like the healthcare industry has never been busier, obviously. There are other industries like the entertainment industry that are still struggling as people are returning to some sense of normalcy. And so there's a lot of unevenness here, and to apply an across the board decision to end unemployment assistance, I think hurts a lot of people and continues to hurt a lot of people that have been hurting since the beginning of the pandemic and struggling to be able to get their unemployment benefits that they have earned during the course of their work. We know, and we've heard from many, many constituents who were extremely frustrated, and we share that frustration too, when it comes to the unemployment application system, that it's been an abysmal failure in many, many ways. And, I think the constituents that we've heard from have continued to express a level of frustration that we understand and continue to see. And many are still outstanding and have not been able to get the unemployment assistance that they've earned. And so, there are a lot of outstanding cases, including technical issues that even Delegate Hill was just cited, that are still occurring up through this morning and up through currently. We are still maintaining a list of constituents that we are still actively working on as active cases to be able to seek unemployment assistance for. And so there's still a lot of hurt and pain amongst constituents that have been struggling to be able to get by. And, I think it's just premature to be able to cease and terminate these benefits right now, as the recovery is still uneven and there's still, I think, a ways to go when it comes to rebuilding our economy and general society. So echo and share some of the concerns that my colleagues have.
Clarence, let me just correct my numbers here. I had to look. I was the median annual income in Maryland is $85,000, and the housing value, the median housing value is $315,000, and rent is $1,400. So we're talking about people who he's claiming for just under $38,000 a year would rather stay home than work. Okay. That's real poverty. If $38,000 is enough to incentivize you not to work.
Anything else to add from? All right. So I think we covered the questions that came in on the unemployment assistance issue. So we're going to move on to another issue concerning police reform. This is probably the topic area that we've received the most number of questions on, and obviously very timely as well, and a concern to many of our constituents. This year, we obviously took many steps to reform how our police and law enforcement system operates. There was a very general question. I'll allow folks to be able to kind of touch on this if anyone wants to summarize. If there were any legislation considered or passed this year or being considered for next year regarding the current focus on police accountability, certainly there were. I think, just as a top level, we were one of just a handful of states that took steps to rescind the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights that was initially passed several decades ago. I think Maryland was one of the first states to pass, if not the first state to pass, these measures that I think, given our current outlook and environment, were outdated and in sore need of revision. And so we did take steps to essentially rescind that and put new measures in its place. So allow folks to, maybe touch on these different policies. Anyone wants to begin can go ahead and do so.
First and foremost, one of the things that we attacked, that we thought was needed revision, was the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Maryland had the somewhat unpopular distinction of being the first state to pass such a thing, which probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but ultimately what it did was it allowed for the fox sort of to guard the hen house. Sometimes the fox isn't interested in the hens, and some police officers are very good, but when officers are behaving badly, it's not such a good idea to have them self-evaluating or their own colleagues evaluating them. In as much as they work together, there's some amount of pressure there. And so we were also the first one, I'm sure, I don't know if we're the only state that had a officer's Bill of Rights, but among the ones that have passed one subsequently, we have done away with that, which is going to lead to, we cleared the way then for much more civilian oversight of complaints against police and police behavior. We're not entirely specific about it. We allowed some of it to be to jurisdictions, but the law certainly will require, because I believe the governor vetoed it. But no, that's right. This is one we did during session and we overrode the veto. So the law will require majority civilian oversight and much more transparency of records in cases where police do have complaints filed against them. And they certainly do have them. Like I said, this doesn't imply or imply that all police officers are bad or implicate them, but certainly they are in a position where they have a great deal of power and they need certainly to feel before they act that they are accountable. And then if they do act badly, they need to be accountable.
There were a couple of other provisions that I think were also of interest. So we tightened up and narrowed the requirements needed to authorize a no-knock warrant. And a lot of that stuff is echoed in some of the federal legislation that's trying to move forward, and we've done that. We've also increased, I think, broadly transparency, training, support, and accountability with respect to how officers conduct themselves with the public. And one big piece of that is to try and stop the situation where a bad actor, an officer who is really not living up to his responsibilities to the community, is not living up, frankly, to his responsibilities to his fellow officers, gets removed from serving in one jurisdiction. And because the records don't follow, he immediately gets hired in another one. So those are, I think, broadly speaking, some of the other important things that we did with respect to law enforcement.
Well, I'll just add to that. I think we can't underestimate the importance of body cameras and having the requirement that although the legislation does give the local jurisdictions a few years to get sort of up and running in full implementation of body cameras, I think that really is an important piece for accountability and seeing what situations really are. We all are aware of the importance of video footage, though not from a body camera. Video footage of the murder of George Floyd, and having body camera footage, I think, will be really important for police accountability and for the protection of police who are acting in good faith and acting appropriately under very difficult conditions. So I think that the body cameras are really an important piece.
Yeah, and I'll close by just adding, I think there were also provisions that improved transparency around police discipline records, so that I think we all recognize that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are behaving properly and correctly and appropriately. However, there's some bad apples, just like there are bad apples in many different professions. But we want to make sure that those bad apples can't just move from one police force to another. And so improving the transparency around police discipline records will help prevent that. There are also provisions that would expand mental health services for officers. Given the stresses and potential risks of the job, I think this was also important. We decided to incorporate that into some of the provisions that were passed into law as well.
One we skipped, we just need to say that we put some severe limitations on use of force and no-knock warrants in the state.
I said no-knock warrant.
They have, both of those have obviously resulted in folks' death, and we felt we need to put some limitations on those in terms of hours and conditions under which they can be used by law enforcement.
Right. So still on the topic of police reform, we had a few questions that came in, with regards to crime. And I guess some folks, particularly in the Baltimore County area, were concerned about rising rates of crime in Baltimore City and how that potentially could bleed over into Baltimore County and Southwest Baltimore County. And the questions, to kind of paraphrase them, were along lines of, how the police reform bills that were passed into statute would affect crime in Baltimore County, as well as how they might impact Baltimore County's oversight process into use of force.
It's interesting. Before we went into session, Baltimore County Police met with, or at least offered to meet with all of the representatives to the General Assembly. And I think I think most of us, if not all of us, went and we sat through their training session. And one of the things they were trying to stress is that many of the things that were being pushed at the state and the things that we passed were changes that they had already implemented, were things that they already had put into place. So I have not heard from Baltimore County law enforcement since the passing of the legislation. And I suspect from what the administration has said is the county feels like these are reforms that they can implement that will strengthen them. I can't speak for them. I think overall, we hear about some rise in some types of violent crime, but we're still seeing overall a decrease in crime in the last 20 years. So crime overall is going down. So I don't have any reason to think that this is going to make things worse. I think some of the other changes that we've seen with respect to more regionalism in terms of how information is shared between Baltimore County, Hartford County, Baltimore City, Howard County, and surrounding jurisdictions is also going to continue to be helpful. And I also think some of the behavioral health supports that we're putting into place, earlier recognition and more robust support for people who are going through behavioral health crises, I think all of that is going to make for less problems with crime. I don't know how, taking away people's unemployment support will play out, and the other stresses around the reopening that we're still going through. But I think overall, this should not have a deleterious effect on the county.
I'll add, Delegate Feldmark, do you want to talk?
Well, I was just going to add, I think the other thing to recognize really is, and this may be a little bit of a longer term impact of this legislation, but, increasing accountability and restoring public faith and confidence and trust in the police department is really important to have the community police partnership that ideally makes policing most effective, right? And so I think that as communities, feel more comfortable working with the police, policing becomes more effective. So I think those are really important impacts also.
Yeah, Delegate Feldmark took my response, but I think that was spot on, which was the fact that, having a level of trust between the community and law enforcement is actually very important to keep the community safe as well. And I think in many ways, our law enforcement system, just broadly speaking, has challenges and sometimes is broken. And so the bills that we passed into statute this session were really aimed at reforming and rebuilding that level of public trust with law enforcement so that our communities overall can still be safer. And I think these are not contrary goals. I think these can work hand in hand with each other to help reform the law enforcement system as well as making our community safer. They're not mutually exclusive. And so it's a balance because with a lot of these policies, you don't want to make it too challenging for law enforcement to be able to enforce the laws that we pass into statute. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that communities can trust their law enforcement officials to behave in appropriate and proper manners. And so, I think this level of trust is important, and the balance that we were able to strike in the bills that we passed into statute really aimed at doing that. Any other responses? If not, we also had a question, I guess that was very specific, pertaining to qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. So this question was, did the police reform bill remove qualified immunity for officers? I'll try to take a stab at this first. If anyone else wants to chime in, you're welcome to do so. The basic answer to that is no. Unfortunately, the bill did not remove qualified immunity for officers. Just as a baseline for everyone, qualified immunity is a concept that you can't necessarily sue a police officer for violating an individual's rights or your rights unless that police officer knew that he or she was violating your rights. The concern that some people have here is that there have been cases throughout communities where I think everyone would, by consensus, agree that someone's rights were violated. However, there's no recourse for these individuals to be able to sue in a court of law. None of the police reform bills addressed qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is actually a creation of a Supreme Court decision, so it's not based on legislation. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that the impact of qualified immunity is mostly in federal civil rights cases. So there really isn't an ideal way to be able to address qualified immunity unless the Supreme Court or Congress acts to clarify that or clarify their interpretation of the statute. Does anyone have anything else you want to add about qualified immunity? No. Okay. So we also, related to police reform and law enforcement, had some questions about gun violence. And I know this is an interest of myself and other colleagues as well. So we have a broad question, which is, what kind of gun violence legislation are you or we focusing on for the next year? Anyone want to take a first stab at that? Delegate Hill?
I think, I don't know what will be coming up in the next year. I think the biggest piece of legislation that we looked at this year and passed, but I believe it was vetoed, correct me if I'm wrong, was the long guns and requiring, in terms of transferring of ownership and some other long guns. And of course, as a female, I'm particularly concerned about long guns because they are very commonly used in domestic violence situations. But that was the focus. And Maryland does have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. And so I think it was about, we've been looking at what loopholes are there and how we tighten those up. But I don't know about what will be coming up. Does anyone know if the long guns, am I right about that? And was that vetoed?
So I believe that was a veto last year that we overrode this session. And
I think the question may be broadly to, are there any gun violence prevention priorities that you would want to focus on this coming session too? I guess the 2022 session.
So I will say I have not worked on any gun violence legislation as the primary sponsor. I've been a strong supporter, but I know we have a number of colleagues on the Judiciary Committee who have sort of been the champions of those issues. But I will say, related to that, I think one of the issues that overlaps is mental health services and access to quality behavioral health supports. When we talk about gun violence and deaths by gun, of course, one of the major sources and tragic sources of that is suicide with a gun. And so I think we really, as part of this, looking at the behavioral health and public health aspects of gun violence is an important piece too.
I think going forward, another point of focus can be, and I hope it will be, as Delegate Feldmark expressed this quite clearly, we serve in a lot of different committees, so we rely on people who are experts in other committees, and certainly the Judiciary Committee handles a lot of those issues. But one is gun safety in the home, the responsibility of gun owners to have guns stored away. If you listen to the radio much, you hear the commercial about the 3 situations. One where a gun gets stolen out of a home because it's easy to get, later is used to injure someone or kill someone in the commission of a crime. One where a teenager who is depressed gets a hold of a gun and kills themselves. And of course, one of the ones that disturbs me just as much as the other two, but sometimes more, where 2 young children find a gun and one ends up injuring or killing the other. These are the responsibility, in my opinion, of the owners of the guns. They need, if they're going to own a gun, and apparently that's going to be something that we hold fast to in the United States, that you should have a gun. We need to make sure that they are kept safe, and that is the responsibility of the owner. And if something goes wrong, that owner is responsible. It doesn't fix all those situations I just described, but just as before, if there is the potential for people to be punished or to be held responsible, perhaps they will be responsible if they choose to hold those weapons in their house. That would be a focus that I would like to see us go for.
And just to, for some time now in Maryland, it has been law that you have to, your guns have to be locked up, particularly if they're children who could potentially access them. So even though they're being overturned in other states, those kinds of laws. Yeah.
I was adding on, there are safety devices we can require on guns, fingerprint.
Right, we have gun safety
like
locks have to be required on sets.
And so there are a number of other ways that guns can be made safe rather than just putting a lock on them. I used to laugh because, being a teacher, people used to say teachers should have, there was a brief period where people suggested teachers have guns to I don't know, do what with, but shoot with, I suppose, but that we would lock them up. But I know, and many people know, that not always maliciously, but sometimes just for the challenge, juveniles are creative in finding ways to get around various things. And so we need to have these protections be as thorough and as unbreakable as possible.
I'll just touch on 2 things briefly at the end here. I think I do have a concern about ghost guns, and these are guns that are untraceable in a way, because you could mail order them, or you could purchase them in ways that don't go through the standard manufacturing process, and therefore these guns don't have serial numbers and they can't be traced or tracked. And so we did have legislation that I think was introduced in the shortened 2020 legislative session to try to address ghost guns. Unfortunately, did not pass. I think there was some compromise legislation that was looked at the last session. I don't think that passed either. And so, I think there's room to be able to address this loophole here with ghost guns, hopefully in the 2022 session, because I think it is a very real concern for these guns that, have no way to be able to track where they came from, their origin, or if they were used in a crime or not. The other thing I want to touch on just briefly too is gun violence prevention programs. So Baltimore City, for example, has had a very successful program called Safe Streets Baltimore. These are crime intervention programs where community outreach individuals are designated to be able to help intervene early in potential altercations or conflicts to be able to prevent gun violence from occurring. It takes a lot of work. It does take a lot of legwork, but they have a very successful model that's been proven through studies done at Hopkins and other places, where these gun violence intervention programs are actually very successful in reducing the number of gun-related crimes in certain areas. They're really focused on using kind of an epidemiological model. So being able to recognize that oftentimes gun violence mimics what you would see in disease outbreaks, where if you have an instance of gun violence in a particular neighborhood, it's also likely to raise the risk that you would have potential violence subsequently later on. To be able to concentrate resources and programs and services to be able to reduce the likelihood that you would see future gun violence in that area. Those programs are perennially underfunded, so it's really tough to be able to support and fund those programs to have real outreach being done in those neighborhoods, but they've been very successful, and I would hope that we can continue to be able to find resources to support these types of programs. So I think we've thoroughly covered that question. We're going to pivot very briefly to education, but one that covers both education and law enforcement is related to school resource officers. We did have a few questions come in with regards to SROs and legislation pertaining to them. This is a tricky issue, one that I know all of us have been involved in examining over the last session, but there were some questions related to bills that would shift, for example, funding from SROs and expand their ability to be used for student support services. Unfortunately, none of these bills passed in the past session, and the questions, and we received a few of them pertaining to SROs, was, where do we see this going in future sessions, and any suggestions for legislation coming forward in the future as to how to address this concern?
I think everybody's going to let me go on this one. So there's a lot of layers to this issue. SROs are something that is relatively new in schools since about the 1990s, 1980s, various school systems. When the speaker put together a commission to look at law enforcement reform, she charged them with a number of things. SROs were not on the list of things she charged them with. So the sort of omnibus bill we had on police reform and law enforcement reform did not include anything on SROs, because that was not the charge of that commission to create legislation they would go forward with. What has resulted is sort of a mirror of what goes on with SROs. There were various pieces of legislation, some of them quite good, some of them of questionable nature. But the reality is that the presence of police officers in our state is varied in the way that police officers are put in schools, their role in schools, how many there are in schools. It varies a great deal. And so the two bills that Senator Lamb is talking about, one actually would have shifted $10 million in funding. Now, let's be clear, SROs are not funded with $10 million. There are some grants for that. In fact, I'm not positive the arrangement in Baltimore County, but I do know that in Howard County, the police department supplies those through an MOU to the schools without any outside funding. So the shifting of that money wouldn't have impacted the use of SROs, at least in that way, in Howard County. And it's relevant. The reason I know that so clearly is because one of the things, since all counties are different, the Howard County delegation had to deal with a suggested bill to remove SROs from school entirely. And so on a number of levels, but the other bill that statewide that has been for 2 years and was one by Delegate Washington, who's the chair of the education subcommittee that I serve on, which was to limit the sort of actions that SROs would be available to work with in schools. Specifically, routine discipline would be outside of their purview. They would be charged with dealing with situations that were breakings of the law or arrestable offenses or dangerous offenses. But they wouldn't be allowed, for example, to hustle kids to class on time or moderate a food fight in the cafeteria, because unfortunately, since they're employees of the police department in many, many cases, they deal with it from a much more law enforcement point of view. Now, it's important to note that SROs are trained at the Maryland Center for School Safety. I mentioned earlier that I serve on the advisory board to that, and they must be trained. But in reality, some of them take that training more seriously than others, just like everything. We've talked about this in all professions, but it's true in the police profession, especially with regard to SROs. They do, though, have a unique training that helps them to understand their role, hopefully, in a school setting. Now, that all said, one of the things that I did as a teacher is I kind of thought the SROs were nice to have around. I saw them interact with kids positively, thought that was a good thing. However, I'm clearly white, and I see it from that perspective is one that I see it from. I'm working very hard to see it from another one, where I hear from people of color and even people from low socioeconomic groups that when they are in school and they see an officer walking around with a weapon, often, and in uniform and with handcuffs and various other devices, that they see it as a threat, and it makes them uncomfortable and actually reduces their outlook toward the learning process. So there are a lot of compromises possible. We can go, I've gone for a little bit on this. One of them has to do with having community resource officers that might be assigned to come to a school but not be housed in the building necessarily. I believe we'll see a lot more legislation about SROs, and hopefully we'll arrive at a good compromise. There are school administrators who say that they're a tremendous help to them. That sounds good, but sometimes we say, what kind of help are they? We want administrators. There's a whole other layer of people that can be in schools that can help with that sort of thing. School safety officers who are not necessarily police officers. They may be retired. They may not be police officers at all. That could be in the building to help with security in the building, something that we feel like we need and maybe have students feel safer. So that answer went all around the barn, but I'll allow my friends to say a few words about it too.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, let me just say, I think, Delegate Ebersol really did an excellent job of, pointing out where some of the benefits are and some of the problems are. And what we see in both Baltimore County and Howard County is, depending on what district and depending on your neighborhood, some folks think SROs are, the best thing since sliced bread, and some folks are really, really concerned about it. And part of it has to do with, what your perspective is, but part of it has also to do with what you think the problems are. And when I speak to, and for the past 5 or 6 years, when I speak to teachers, even at the elementary school level, what they've talked about and what we as a legislative body have tried to do is increase behavioral health supports, because that is a significant issue. In terms of the teachers are being asked to teach and to do social work and to do discipline and to do a whole range of things. And part of the model for SROs, if you recall, they were really introduced because we thought that it might stop some of those armed assaults on students, right, that we were seeing a few years ago. And what really pushed that legislation ago is the case in I think it was St. Mary's County. But what we found out since then in the instances around the country is that the timing difference doesn't seem to be sufficient enough for that to be the justification. The idea of police officers being officer friendly and kids getting used to that, there are lots of ways you can do that, whether it's police officers who are coaches in the school or who have, the PAL and other organizations. There are lots of ways. You don't have to have police officers serving in the role of an SRO for young people to get used to the idea that they can be a support and a resource to them. We also had, this issue of a teacher at Wild Lake a few years, before that, having a heart attack as he broke up a fight. And that has brought up another problem with the SROs, is that they're being trained, but often the training going down in different jurisdictions around the state to the teachers and the administrators is inadequate. And they're calling them to handle things that frankly, the teachers and administrators should be handling. And so maybe not in Maryland, but we've certainly seen in other places, a kid's on a cell phone and doesn't get off and the SRR was called. And we certainly saw in Maryland, a 5-year-old, who left school. And it wasn't an SRO who went up, but it was two police officers who did horrific things, traumatized the kid. So it's not that SROs are bad. It's just that we've got to figure out what are the proper supports that we need to have in the schools to serve the needs of the students, the teachers, and the administrators, and when and how is any kind of law enforcement presence appropriate. And then the unspoken thing is, one of the advantages to having law enforcement in there is because they're always law enforcement. So they're never first officer friendly, they're always law enforcement. But when they've got their ears in the school, right, then they know about what's happening out in the community. And so even if a kid is, arrested out in the community, I think for law enforcement, the idea of not having those ears to know what crimes may be committed by some kid not in school, but they can hear it talked about, that's an extra resource for them. And from their perspective, that helps law enforcement in the community. But is that really what you want to subject kids to in order for us to get that done? And frankly, I'll just say this and get off of it. I don't think that the idea of 20 years from now, our solution to education and to crime should be police schools is where we want to be going. And so I think that we're asking the right questions and figuring out the best ways to make this turn to get them out of being sort of an integral part of our education system.
I'll just add on briefly. I think both of my colleagues who've addressed this so far have, really identified some of the complexities and different perspectives. But from my perspective, the underlying question is, our schools are supposed to be there for education, right? For educating our children. And one of the things that I find most concerning is that if there are students who are intimidated or made to feel uncomfortable by the police presence in the school, that compromises their education. And I think we have to be able to, find a solution that addresses that. There are a lot of needs and functions and benefits that are served in different ways through how we have used SROs, but I'm not sure that SROs are the only way to address those needs. So I really think we need to be, looking at what are the needs we need to meet and recognizing that fundamental in those needs is education and a safe and supportive learning environment for all of our students.
Okay, so we'll continue along the education theme. We had a few questions with regards to education. One of the questions pertains to the COVID vaccination in the school system, particularly for personnel and educators. The question is, will or should all teachers, Howard and Baltimore counties, have to be vaccinated for COVID to teach schools this fall?
Senator, why don't you start?
So this is a tricky question here because I think if you rewind a couple months, there was a lot of pressure to reopen schools, and including pressure from the governor's office. And there was pressure even during a time when the vaccines were not readily available. So if you rewind the clock back to February and March, I think there was an edict that was kind of put out by the State Board of Education, by MSDE and the governor's office, to require that some form of in-person instruction be available in the school systems, in the public school systems, beginning sometime in March. And yet, when we asked the acting secretary at the time of the Maryland Department of Health, specifically whether teachers that wanted to get vaccinated would be assured that they would be able to get a vaccine before going back into the classroom when they were being directed to do so in March, they could not actually give us that assurance. And so, I serve on the Senate Vaccine Oversight Work Group, which met weekly with the acting secretary at the time to review our vaccine rollout. And this was, of immense concern because we were basically pressing educators to go back into the classrooms and yet not being able to provide that assurance that they would be able to have basic safeguards like a vaccine, even though they were in many ways considered one of the top tiers to get vaccinated when you look at the state's phases for the vaccine rollout. Now, the paradigm is certainly flipped, and the vaccine is much more readily available to the general public, to the community, and also to educators. So right now, there is not a requirement that educators have to be vaccinated before going to teach in person in our schools. I think these decisions are oftentimes being made and left to the local school systems to decide upon this. I think the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, on the federal level, has said that employers can require employees to be vaccinated for COVID if they make that a policy across the board and it's treated equally across the board to all employees. I'm not aware of any public school systems that have moved in this direction to require employees to be vaccinated. I think there are certain sectors and industries that are discussing this. I think in higher education, for example, there have been requirements that have been put in place for college students, for example, that are coming back in August to demonstrate that they have been vaccinated in order to be able to come back to campus, for example. Some higher ed institutions are also moving in a direction where their faculty and staff will have to be vaccinated as well. So you're seeing some of that move towards that direction with regards to higher ed. I think the University System of Maryland has actually put out a requirement for students, and maybe very soon, if they haven't already, be putting out a requirement for faculty and staff, but not aware that any public school system, certainly not any public school system here in Maryland, has made that a requirement yet. I think the focus right now, as you're seeing from lotteries and other incentives, are really to use carrots to try to encourage people to do the right thing and employees to do the right thing to get vaccinated. It certainly helps the community, safeguards, even those who are not in schools, and safeguards are students as well. So I think that's been the focus for now. Anything else that anyone would like to add?
Sure. The idea of having people be vaccinated before they are required by law to come together, or people who are working, meeting people who are required by law to be there, is not a new one. It's not without precedent. As a teacher, before I could go into a classroom, I had to have a tuberculosis test to make sure that I didn't have TB. And students are required to have certain vaccinations already before they can enter a public school classroom. I don't have the list in front of me, but there is a list. And students are asked to show evidence of being vaccinated against those things, for the simple reason that if they're not, they can carry it. And if you have more than one, then they can give it to each other. And since vaccinations, as we all know, and I'm sure my good doctors will tell me, my statistician side says, they're not 100% effective, okay? They work very well. All vaccinations do. This one in particular is a good one. But I still, personally, if I were a teacher, and I sometimes wish I still was, would be very aware that if I was vaccinated, that gives me 90% probability of immunity against someone who is infected or near me. And I think it's reasonable for people who are coming together to be asked to behave in a responsible manner around each other. We do things as simple as tell people to sneeze into their elbows in the old days when we had colds, in order not to infect each other. And I think school systems will make this decision on their own. Ultimately, there may be a state edict on this one. Local control wouldn't be a bad idea, but in the interest of the health of students, teachers, all school personnel, psychologists, all the people who are in that building, cafeteria workers, I believe that that once this vaccine becomes something that is more readily accepted largely, and we feel like we can do that, we're going to have to ask people who want to interact in a public way like that without choice. I don't have to go to a store if I don't want to, but if I'm a teacher, I have to work, and the law requires students to be in school. Now, there are ways to get around that, but not everybody has the luxury of homeschooling because they can't stay home. They have to get to work to earn the very salaries that Delegate Hill was talking about earlier. So I foresee that as COVID remains, and I think, again, the good doctors and even Delegate Fellmark will say that we won't be done with COVID. We will certainly have it well under control is the hope, but that it will still continue to remain a threat, just as rubella and all those other diseases remain a threat to us, that we will have to continue to be vigilant in making sure that we ask people to act responsibly around each other.
I'd also say that just to add one little wrinkle to it, the ability to, Senator Lamb spoke to what came out of the EOC. Traditionally, you could not require a vaccine. A vaccine could not be required if it was not approved by the FDA. And right now, our vaccines are still under emergency approval. And so, Senator Lamb, to your knowledge and the current status under emergency approval, would a entity be required, as you said before, as long as it was across the board, or would that require that they be recognized on a non-emergency basis and available on a non-emergency basis, fully approved by the FDA before they could be mandated?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The EOC actually specifically addressed this in their guidance that they put out. It is that employers can require per employer policy if they choose, and that includes for FDA emergency use authorized vaccines as well. And so, there's a difference between EUA, emergency use authorization, which is what all the vaccines are under right now, and formal FDA approval, which is a little bit more rigorous. They want to see a little bit more data, see more evidence to support the efficacy and safety of a drug. We're getting there. In all likelihood, probably sometime in December or January, the Pfizer vaccine will be formally approved by FDA, if not sooner. The manufacturers have asked for FDA approval, and I think Moderna as well. So we may get in that direction, but it's a good question that there is a distinction there between the two. All right, so we would be remiss to talk about education if we didn't have a blueprint question. So we have a question here, and it's a bit detailed. So I'm just going to read this briefly, and probably Delegate Ebersol will answer that. So the question is, the blueprint is a fabulous achievement for education in Maryland, but there's some significant issues with it. One issue is that the career ladder excludes anyone who is ineligible for the National Board for Certification of Teachers, NBCT. This includes people that are, for example, school psychologists, social workers, speech and language pathologists, and occupational therapists. What is your plan to include these valuable professionals in these salary enhancements? And there's a second question here that I'll also just put out there so that maybe we can address both of them together. The second issue is that there are millions of dollars that were put in the hands of private and nonprofit companies to do various things for our school system, such as provide mental health supports. In this person's view, the funds would be much better spent investing in school systems themselves, including hiring union-backed staff, fixing facilities, buying materials, instead of spending these on contractors. There are many legislators that have been very critical of public and private partnerships for things like highway and rail expansion. Why are these partnerships not okay for our roads in the eyes of legislators who are critical of these public-private partnerships, but they're okay for our schools? And why not commit to investing these dollars in our school systems?
So Kyle, I know that's you because I have the spreadsheet in front of me. And these are great questions. I kind of wish you'd ask them to me not in front of everybody. The answers are yes and yes. Okay. You know that compromises were made when the blueprint was passed, and school psychologists and other groups like yourself suffered. And I don't think they should have. And I said so at the time because we know that we've learned through the years that there's much more to a school than a group of teachers. I happen to think they're very important people in the school. I was one. So to me, it's significant. But the support systems that exist are critical to us, both special educators and folks like yourself who help students who are troubled and need guidance. And I think that should be included. Now, will I be able to do that? I'm certainly going to talk about it, and you've certainly brought it to the fore for me. So thank you. And I will advocate. I can't make promises. On the subject of PPP, I agree with you there also. What happened, you probably know that, and I'll tell other folks, is that the development of special needs students who were had great need and were very difficult to manage is that in some school systems, they just didn't feel equipped to do it. And so what sprang up were support networks, non-public schools, as we call them. We don't necessarily call them private schools because students don't register for them. School systems recommend and pay sometimes significant amounts of money to have them there. And so you're right, it is in a way a public-private partnership that I think, in the large paradigm of the dollars that we collect from people for taxes that we decide to use for education should all be used in an equitable manner for all students to access them and in the best possible way. And that means also the most economical way while still being effective. And I believe that school systems are equipped to develop that. Now, some school systems have some systems like that. We have schools both in Baltimore County and Howard County that handle some of the more difficult students, but not sometimes the most difficult students. And we have a lot of folks like you who are working with the rank and file in the buildings who I think should be recognized for what you do. And I think also should be expanded and tasked with helping us with helping out in perhaps special schools within the counties with students like that. So you win. Those are two good questions. I would like to do both of those things.
Anyone want to add to that?
Since Kyle knows how to reach me, he's going to hold my feet to the fire on that one. I have a feeling.
All right. So seeing no other responses there, why don't we move on to another big issue that I think is important and a priority for all of us. So that pertains to the environment. So we will begin with kind of a broad question. So post-COVID, so after the pandemic, will the state prioritize and increase incentives for climate change solutions? This may include solar and wind generation for government buildings, electric vehicle charging, et cetera.
I would just say that I think dealing with climate change and having the proper climate policy going forward is going to be a priority. Frankly, it was a priority of this most recent legislative session. It blew up at the end, but I think in some ways it was because the Senate bill that was coming forward was putting all the pieces together, and the House seemed to prefer taking it in parts, and there's a lot to weigh out. So I think absolutely. Now, whether it's simply giving additional incentives or renewing our incentives for solar and for electric cars, putting in more charging stations, there's just a lot of stuff moving, being smarter about our infrastructure and our transportation needs, and doing, I think all four of us have been pushing for, less about expanding roads and more about integrated transportation, through rail and bus routes and that kind of stuff. Senator Lamb and I have both fought to put legislation through, and I carried it actually this past year, to make the state be more responsible in how we use energy in our buildings, which has a myriad of benefits. So, there's a lot there, and I've been pushing for a while to get some really comprehensive mattress waste management stuff. And I think one bill that we did get through is going to, get the state to start looking at, downstream uses for recycled materials. So whether it's energy conservation, pushing for solar or wind, talking about is there going forward going to be a role for nuclear, because there are many people who would say that if we're really talking about hitting our global goals, you can't really have a conversation if you're not somehow incorporating nuclear into it. And I know that's a touchy subject, but waste stream management and recycling also requires that there be markets to do something with that waste. And that's been one of the problems is we can retain or pull out and recycle waste, but if there's no market for it, there's no money to be made in that. So I think there's a lot, and Delegate, Philmark had a wonderful bill. I mean, so we have little environmental pieces and big environmental pieces, and I was thinking about your right to repair. So I think environment's going to have to continue to be a huge part of our thrust, and hopefully we'll be more successful in the next session in getting some larger pieces through than we were in the last session.
Well, that sounds like a segue, so thank you, Delegate Hill. Yeah, the right to repair bill I had is an important waste reduction bill. Unfortunately, it did not pass this year, so we are going to regroup on that and figure out our approach to try again. But on the issue of climate solutions and the disappointment, and I consider it one of the sort of big disappointments of the session that the Climate Solutions Now Act did not pass. We are, every time we miss an opportunity to take that kind of legislative action, we're just compressing the need, right? The urgency and need is just accelerating as we postpone. So I think we do need to be willing to make some really big commitments on climate change, and pushing for solutions. So I am very optimistic that we will correct that next session, but recognizing that the need is not postponing every time we postpone to take action, right? So we're just compressing our timeline. The other thing I want to say, and it ties to climate change certainly, but also huge economic justice and equity issues around transportation, right? And so we were able to pass the Transportation Investment and Safety Act. Of course, the governor unfortunately vetoed it. So that is both a huge blow to our citizens who depend on public transportation, and on the climate benefits of seeing more of our transportation needs shifted to public transit. So I think that I'm looking forward to overriding that veto, and I think that needs to be an important part of our climate strategy as well.
Delegate Ebersol, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I was going to let you go. You didn't get a chance, and
No, go ahead.
So we have the best district team, by the way. District 12 is easily the most dynamic team. But you should know that we have a really good team in the next district over in Howard County. We talked about all that law enforcement reform. Delegate Atterbury, who's vice chair of the Judiciary Committee, was really the point on that. But when it comes to environmental, we also have a delegate nearby named Delegate Terrassa, who actually I've come to understand is watching us tonight. So it would be nice to say something nice to her. She had a bill that sounded pretty simple about requiring at first new construction to install electric charging stations in new houses and new apartment complexes and what. We even backed off a little and said they had to offer it. You would not have believed the amount of resistance we got to that on the floor. And it's the same old argument. This is going to hurt the business. This is going to be bad. But just as the other two delegates have said, we're going to have to make some significant investments in our future. That comes to, which we should be doing right now, installing east-west public transportation in Baltimore. It should be underway right now. It's not. It's going to be more expensive. But in the end, these are investments in our future. And simply offering that when someone builds a house, would you like to have that? They're required to say to them, would you like to have an electric charging station at your new home? And making that possible. That passed the Senate. The governor could not bring himself to sign that bill. He allowed it to pass into law. And yet, I think the pressure on him from developers and from other folks is so intense that he felt like he couldn't sign that. And that, to me, is metaphoric for the entire argument. Are we willing to look more than 2 or 3 years in the future? Are we willing to look a generation ahead? And for folks like Delegate Hill and I, that, we may not be around to see those things, but we still feel they're very, very important. Those youngsters, maybe they'll do it if we pull it off, but we really have to make investments. Some of them will be costly and difficult, but in the end, we'll be very glad we did. I mean, I always point to the Washington Metro system, which, same arguments when that went to go in. And in the end, it helps that city so much in terms of its traffic and pollution, its greenhouse emissions. So bills like this just shouldn't be that big of an argument, and they are. And I commend Delegate Terrazzo for getting it into law.
Well, I think Delegate Eversole and Delegate Hill will always be around. They're timeless. So, from my perspective, will always be 55 and 33, but that's an inside.
You can just look at her. She's a lot younger than I am. Okay, so just take a look.
So we did have one more question on the environment that came in, and then also in transportation that was kind of answered already. I think, why don't we deal with the transportation question first, because I think that's pretty straightforward and we can probably answer for all of us, which is, as Delegate Feldmark mentioned, there was a bill, I think it was HB 114, to address funding for the Maryland Transit Administration and also to support a study of the MARC rail line extension. Unfortunately, that was vetoed. So this was the Transit Safety and Investment Act. And I think all of us, I can say safely, will support an override of that veto when we get back to session next year. The last environmental question had to deal with how will the right to charge bill work for HOAs? And so just a little bit of background. So this is regarding EV infrastructure, electric vehicle charging stations and EV infrastructure. I think Delegate Eversole mentioned a bill that was sponsored by our colleague in Howard County, Delegate Terrazzo, to require builders to at least mention the option of being able to install EV charging equipment and infrastructure for new builds that are occurring. Very basic bill. And that did pass. There was also a companion bill that was sponsored, I think, by Delegate Corman to require builders for new developments, particularly multi-use housing developments, so condos and apartments, to allow the tenants or buyers to have electric vehicle equipment installed as part of the build out for that development. And so this legislation passed to allow those who lived in these HOAs and condos to install electric vehicle charging equipment and make it easier for them to do so. And if a member has a designated parking spot within that HOA, they would have to allow them somehow to, within reason, install a charger, except in some limited circumstances. So the HOA is permitted to require the owner to pay for the installation of that charger and also to cover any electrical costs that might occur as a result of that charger. So, so that's the right to charge bill, so to speak, and what it does. Anyone want to add anything about this?
Well, I guess I do. I think that both at the federal level and everything, we're talking about the electric cars. And I've driven a hybrid now for, I guess, 20 years, and I have the ability, if I go all electric, to get some kind of a charging station. But Delegate Feldmark mentioned earlier sort of the disparities, in the environmental justice issue. So even as we look at this, there are plenty of people who live in homes with on-street parking, right? Or apartment buildings that don't have garages. And so as federally, we're moving towards, 80% or whatever the golden number is, electric vehicles and rechargeable vehicles in the next 10 years. What's happening to those folks, right? So charging stations are great. 15 years ago, we were looking at the option of if charging stations weren't going to work, could there be a battery exchange station? So instead of going in and getting gasoline, you go and they take out your used electric or battery, they put in a new one, it's fully charged, and you go on your way, because those don't take that long. So our infrastructure planning actually in the state and nationally has to be a lot smarter. It has to not take people of lesser means and exclude them and think that the same solutions that work for folks who have 2 and 3 car garages or apartment buildings where everyone gets a garage slot are going to work for other folks, and to say to them, well, you'll just have to charge on your way to and from work, or you'll just have to fight for it at the office. Again, not everyone has a job where they can go to, and just putting, requiring that there be charging stations there is going to resolve that problem. So I think we have to broaden our solutions approach to make sure that, unlike so many times in the past, that we don't leave significant parts of our society behind as we plan on how we move forward.
Great. I should clarify just to Delegate Corman's bill on the right to charge that it's to prevent an HOA board from stopping the installation of EV charging equipment except in very limited circumstances. This does apply to current developments as well. So if you live in a current development that has an HOA, they should not be able to prevent you from being able to put an EV charger in. There's nothing else to add on that issue. We're nearing the end of our time here. I think we're going to wrap at 8:30. There was a very specific question on state parks. I'll go ahead and read this one and go from there. So, has there been any update on the state buying the land by the old paper mill on River Road? This is in Baltimore County, and adding that area to Patapsco Valley State Park. There's a wonderful trail and bridge there that no one can park to access it. This would make a second or another parking area. And on a related note, people are parking along Route 1 near the park entrance when it's closed due to overcrowding. This is creating a traffic and pedestrian hazard. So the first part, I know, and this is kind of the teamwork that our offices have, we kind of shared these issues, and I know Delegate Ebersol has been working on the first one, I think. The second issue along Route 1, it's one that's not unheard of. We've heard that actually quite often when usage of the park is up. But Delegate Ebersol, do you want to address the parking issue along River Road?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. I appreciate that. We're in the process. That land is privately owned, as is the right-of-way road that's through it. That's why when people park there, they get towed, because that company can send in a towing company, because you're parking on, it'd be like them parking in my front yard, although not as egregious, still legally, they can tow them. There's a lot of feeling that parking there is not really safe. And so also Howard County and Baltimore County have taken it upon themselves to entreat the DNR to ticket people. And if you've been through lately, you'll know that the ticket has gone up from around $35 to $125. This is obviously designed to discourage people from parking there right now. And yet we want people to be able to park there. And there is a place, if that lot were to be able to be opened, there is a nonprofit called Friends of Patapsco Valley, which is working, and this is as much detail as I'm allowed to give about that, to help DNR and us to acquire that property and turn it into a parking lot, which then DNR might actually make us one of the inexpensive paid areas, the $2, $3 to get in to park there and use the park. I think that'd be highly valuable, both because it would create a less dangerous situation for people who choose to park there, and also because it would allow some access to the park at that location. We're also fighting a similar parking problem. It's actually in our district. It's just that Landing Road is a division, but along Landing Road, people are also parking to access the park down into the Cascade Falls area. And there is an acquisition of property occurring there also, which will be used, first of all, to mitigate headwater runoff into Cascade Falls, but also might be used in an environmental way to create parking there. So the short answer is, and here it comes, we are working on it. And I think myself and my colleagues here see the value of Patapsco Valley State Park and the value of it near our district and in our district. And we're trying to increase people's access to it. It is a rare piece of kind of almost wilderness property in what is a suburban or semi-urban area on the East Coast and around. It's pretty rare and pretty large. And we'd like it to be used and responsibly because it is so large, but located so close to residential neighborhoods. It's a bit of a sieve. People can come in from a lot of places, which is okay. But actually, if we can kind of control where people are coming in so that we can manage trash and all sorts of other uses. That's kind of what we're going for. As to the parking, I'll let the others talk about that. I had a disturbing thing of seeing a bunch of people parked along Route 40 outside of the Hollowfield area because they couldn't get in there, obviously being ticketed by police as well. Because along Route 40 in that dip between Baltimore County and Howard County, it also says no parking. So we're dealing with a great deal of interest in Patapsco State Park. We're going to try to make it so people who are interested can utilize it.
Well, I think that is, one of the silver linings maybe that came out of the pandemic was a lot of folks who were not visiting the park previously discovered it, right? When other things were shut down and unavailable, folks, turned to go outdoors, which is a great thing. And I think, it's not going to go away after the pandemic because folks have, found the places in the park that they like to go and they're going to want to keep going. So I think we need to, find the solutions to make it safe, safe for coming into the park, and make sure that we have the resources needed in terms of staffing the park to help with maintenance from higher volume. It's a great thing to see more people enjoying the park, but we just need to make sure we have the appropriate resources and solutions to help them do it safely.
I would just add, not directly to the question, but about that part. First of all, we are, really fortunate to have that resource. And I think all four of us are appreciative of the fact that this is a value both to Baltimore County and to Howard County. I think we got $2.5 million to upgrade the trails in the park system, both the part that connects Elk Ridge and Relay around Guinness and further down into Savage. I'm really excited about that. There's also coming before the Board of Public Works this month, something that we haven't spoken about, but there's they're going to be voting on giving $500,000 or so to program open space to acquire a property in Howard County that's right up against the Patuxent Valley State Park along Landing Road, which is in our district. That would be handled, if that goes through, the management of that area would provide additional recreational opportunities. So we are doing a lot of work and supporting initiatives to make it more available. What the question gets to, and the answers I've said, is if we want more people to use it and we don't provide the parking for it, then it's a lost resource. So I think that, we'll continue working with Patapsco Greenway and other groups to look for those opportunities and also to make sure that the park system can get some additional funding, because they're also a system that's been, starved even prior to the pandemic in terms of the resources they need to do the work that we think is so essential. So I just wanted to add that piece while we're talking about open space in the park.
Yeah, and I'll just put a bow on it by tying it to an issue earlier too, that if there was more transit to the park, that would probably alleviate the parking concerns too in the backup along the Route 1 corridor and the entrance too. So very last question. This one is specific, I think, probably to Delegate Hill, and then we'll go ahead and wrap. But this question is: nonprofits for our aging neighbors, or NANA, was enacted back in April 30th, 2019. The Maryland Department of Aging has still not implemented the program. What can be done to get them moving?
Okay, so they're correct. And for people who don't know, so this is a bill that we passed, that I introduced, that created a fund in the Department of Aging to give grants to those not-for-profit agencies that are helping seniors to age in place. So we did pass it in 1919. The governor did not put any funds in it in the budget. So in 2020, we passed a minimal funding legislation, which the governor then vetoed as the pandemic rolled out, as he vetoed many things, saying we don't know how we'll spend our money, so we're not going to spend any money that the General Assembly has required. Of course, the irony of that is during the pandemic, those organizations were so critical that they really needed to have that additional funding to do the job, as folks who were trying to age in place needed greater supports. So we overrode that veto and put $100,000, but it doesn't go into the next fiscal year. It then has a sort of a maintenance of effort component to it. So there will always be money in it. So I had other folks I was talking to just last month who were saying, why can't we apply? We've written to the Department of Aging to ask them for specifics about when the grant request will be available online. We have not heard back, but if he's following the law, which I'm sure he and the department will be, it should be available starting in July when we enter the new fiscal year.
Okay, so we are at time. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this town hall. Want to again thank all of the participants and attendees for joining us this evening for a very comprehensive town hall. As you can tell, we covered a lot of ground, a lot of issues, and so we appreciate you joining us. Please do not be strangers in the interim. There's still a lot going on as we prepare for the 2022 legislative session. You're always welcome to reach out to any of us as well as our offices. I do want to thank all of our super committed staff that made this town hall happen, as well as allowing us to do all the things that we were able to do. So myself, that's Scott Tiffin and Aaron Camp Mansour, Amber Potter from Delegate Hill's office, Katie Meadow from Delegate Feldmark's office, and Sean Mullen from Delegate Eversol's office. So we couldn't do half the things that we accomplished without their support as well. So thank you to our staff. And with that, why don't we go ahead and wrap up and close. Everyone, thank you for joining and have a good evening. Stay safe out there.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you for joining us. Okay.